Wet weather, he would appear in a complete outfit of waterproof stuff, and with his French light blue helmet, he presented a remarkable and unusual figure.
Churchill asked Father at the time, "Do you like war?" Which indicates to me that he thought it was all a bit of a game. A very serious game, but it was all fun nonetheless.
Churchill was invigorated by the danger of the Western Front. As shells exploded around him, he was certain that fate was keeping him safe.
My darling Clemmy, I had just had a splendid hot bath and was feeling quite deliciously clean. Then suddenly, a tremendous bang overhead, and I am covered in soot by a shell these careless Boche exploded above our roof, and dirtying me. Well, it is an odd world, and I have seen a great deal of it.
Churchill told Clemmy he was happier in the trenches than he had been for many months. But he missed the thrill of parliamentary battle. In the summer of 1916, he was able to return home, determined to rebuild his political career. Deeply mistrusted, he was left out of government for a year. Then the Prime Minister, his old ally Lloyd George, brought him back to help finish the war.
I think it wasn't just as a friend, but as a political force. Churchill was not somebody that you wanted on the other side. You wanted to have him with you. And Churchill was a very vigorous, energetic, valuable ally to have with you in the war cabinet. And I think Lloyd George found that he was, as in 1940, Winston was the least defeatist. He was the most cheerful, the most supportive, the best person you could have on a daily basis to help you run a very difficult war.
At the end of the war with Germany in 1918, Churchill became yet more belligerent. His aristocratic blood boiled at the news of the revolution in Russia and the murder of the Tsar and his family. He demanded a new war against the Bolsheviks.
After conquering all the Huns, the tigers of the world, I will not submit to being beaten by the baboons.
Perhaps in the long perspective of history, Churchill was not wrong to try and defeat Bolshevism at its birth, but there was no appetite for a further war on the part of the British, and certainly not my great-grandfather. And he said, the trouble with Winston, he's always getting out his maps. And look what happens. He got out his map of Turkey in 1915, and look where we ended up in Gallipoli. And he's getting out his maps of Russia now, and goodness knows where it'll end, And I think it was at this time Lloyd George said, Churchill's really a Tory at heart.
Within 3 years, Lloyd George's government had collapsed. Recovering from appendicitis, Churchill arrived to contest his seat in Dundee, stricken but aggressive. One constituent called him a dangerous, double-dealing, oily-tongued adventurer. Churchill lost the election. For the first time in 22 years, he was without a seat in Parliament.
In the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix. I was taught to be very fond of Kent. My nanny, Mrs. Everest, said it was the Garden of England.
In 1922, Churchill bought Chartwell, an old manor house near Westerham. Out of political office, he spent 2 years creating a personal haven overlooking the Weald of Kent.
He had fallen completely in love with Churchill. In the week that I was born, actually, my mother had other preoccupations than house hunting or house viewing. He put in an offer for Churchill, which was accepted. My mother was devastated. She thought the whole estate would be too much financially for them. But he had this feeling, as his diligence and genius never failed, that he could do it. I think he had a more cavalier attitude to bills.
In the 1924 general election, the Conservatives were re-elected. Liberal power had all but gone. In Churchill's eyes, the Tories were the only party capable of halting the rise of socialism. He stood for election in Epping and won. Churchill was a Conservative again. "Anyone can rat," he remarked smugly, "but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat." Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin asked the renegade Churchill to be his Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was the great office of state his father had held nearly 40 years before.
I was astonished. I should have liked to answer, "Will the bloody duck swim?" But, as it was a formal and important conversation, I replied, "This fulfills my ambition. I still have my father's robes as Chancellor. I shall be proud to serve you in this splendid office."
Churchill was almost 50. His appointment was greeted with amazement and disgust. The Daily Herald wrote,
"Mr. Churchill's appointment is a joke. He's been successfully Tory, Liberal, and a Tory once more. Nobody denies his great abilities. Mr. Baldwin may well have thought it safer to take him in than leave him out."
Once again, Churchill was at the centre of political life. On Budget Day, accompanied by his daughter Diana, he made a statesmanlike walk to Parliament. His budget speeches were dazzling. Health Minister Neville Chamberlain exclaimed,
"What a brilliant creature he is. I like him, but not for all the joys of paradise would I be a member of his staff." Mercurial is the literal description of his temperament.
In 1926, massive unrest in the coalfields led trade unions to call for a general strike. Churchill sympathized with the impoverished miners and supported their demands for higher wages. But for him, a general strike smacked of Bolshevik revolution. Deputy Cabinet Secretary Thomas Jones.
"Winston overwhelmed me with a cataract of boiling eloquence impossible to reproduce. He said, 'We are at war. We must go through with it. You must have nerve.'
Volunteers were called in to run the transport system and help break the strike. Churchill favoured the deployment of troops, tanks and machine guns. He told Stanley Baldwin that a little bloodshed would do no harm. The general strike was broken within 10 days. Despite his efforts to get a better deal for the miners, socialists across the country would always regard Churchill as the embodiment of heartless Toryism. Over the next 4 years, Churchill became increasingly mistrusted and isolated. In 1931, he was not included in the national government. And while on a lecture tour of the United States, he was hit by a car and nearly killed. Battered, exhausted, and out of office, he found sanctuary at Chartwell.
He is terribly depressed at the slowness of his recovery, and murmurs, "I wish it hadn't happened. I had hoped he would paint, but he does not seem to have the strength or energy to start." He said he did not think he would ever recover completely.
Churchill had finished his autobiography, My Early Life. He called it a picture of a vanished age. Britain had changed. Had he been left behind? Would his youthful exploits be his only history? In a book entitled The Tragedy of Winston Churchill, also published in 1931, journalist Victor Germains asked,
"What is to be Winston Churchill's future? Will he reach his goal, which is to be Prime Minister? One feels doubtful. The ghosts of the Gallipoli dead will always rise up to damn him in times of national emergency. What sensible man is going to place confidence in Mr. Churchill?"
Churchill was 56 years old. His political career seemed to be over. His destiny unfulfilled.